Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 11 of Poll 101 American National Government. This week, we're talking all about Congress, and the lecture is going to be a little on the long side, so I've tried to break up the lecture into two distinct units to kind of break up the content a little bit. So in the first unit of this lecture, we're going to talk about the institutional features of Congress, qualifications for office, why we only have 435 members, and talk a little bit about gerrymandering. So all of those institutional features of Congress. And in part two of this lecture, we will focus on the extremely convoluted process of how a bill becomes a law. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. For Unit 1 of this lecture, we'll be talking about the three major aspects of Congress that generally revolve around representation. We'll talk about the constitutional foundations of Congress and what the Founding Fathers had envisioned for our national legislature, the qualifications for office, and three particular pathways to power that present some general obstacles to how representative our Congress actually is. So we'll talk about how Congress decided to cap their membership at 435, the role that party competitiveness plays in Congress, and then finally, gerrymandering. But to really get into the spirit of politics, I think we need to start back at the beginning. Not that beginning, this beginning, the Constitutional Convention of 1787. As you'll recall from our earlier lectures, there was great contention among the Founding Fathers regarding how they should set up the new Congress. We had the Virginia Plan, also known as the Large State Plan, which was backed mostly by southern states who wanted representation in the new legislature to be based upon population. In other words, because these states were more populous, they wanted representation based on population. And that's the whole essence of politics that we've talked about all semester. Who gets what, when, and how. Those who are in charge, those who make the rules, will always do so in a manner that benefits them most. We're going to see this play out time and time again throughout this lecture specifically. And that's exactly why the smaller New England states, who knew that they would be at a huge power disadvantage if representation was based on population, advocated instead for the New Jersey Plan, which would benefit them most. Equal representation for all states, regardless of population. And as we know, in the Connecticut Compromise, one of the more commendable negotiations in American history, the elements of each plan were merged to create a bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives, where membership would be based upon population, and an upper chamber, known as the Senate, where representation would be equal across all states. So once everyone could finally agree on the actual structure of Congress, it was time to hammer out the details. And this is the focus of Article 1 in the United States Constitution. It answers important questions such as who's eligible to run for office, what qualifications are needed to be a member of the House or the Senate, how long should the term of office be, and most importantly, how much power do we give each of the chambers? So let's take a look at each of these in a little bit more detail. When we look at the qualifications for House and Senate side by side, you might begin to notice some important differences. And this can kind of help illustrate how the framers perceive the underlying purpose of each chamber. You'll notice that the qualifications for being a member of the House are far less stringent than for the Senate. They're younger, citizenship requirements are less strict, they only serve 2-year terms, and they are directly elected by the people. The qualifications for Senate, however, are in stark contrast to the House. Members must be at least 30 years old, and don't be fooled, this wasn't some progressive idea. Back then, the average life expectancy was only 41 years old, so they pretty much already had one foot in the grave anyway. Senators were also expected to be U.S. citizens for almost a decade and were entrusted with far more power by serving 6-year terms. And all of this really highlights disparities in accountability measures between the two chambers. Because members of the House are only elected to 2-year terms, they are held to much higher accountability standards to the people than senators. 2-year terms in the House allow for rapid change that more closely reflects the sentiments of the people. This is why you see more frequent waves of change in the House, like the Tea Party or the Pink Wave, while the longer 6-year terms in the Senate help isolate the chamber from rapid ideological shifts. But perhaps the most important difference between the House and the Senate was how each of these members were, at least originally intended, to be elected. Now, members of the House of Representatives have always been directly elected by the people. It was designed by the framers to be the most democratic chamber of Congress. But remember, most of the Founding Fathers had a really dystopian perspective on the people, often siding with the philosophies of Thomas Hobbes that people were nasty, brutish, and greedy, and that if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. So, according to the framers of the Constitution, in order for a democracy of the people to actually survive, it was deemed necessary to restrict the power of the people. And this was all in efforts to prevent mob rule. And one way to do this was to make sure that the upper chamber of Congress, the Senate, the chamber they also invested far more power in than the House, was elected by the more sophisticated members of society. So in Article 1, Section 3, the framers wrote that senators would be elected by the state legislature and not directly by the people. So this is yet another example of how our government restricts the voice of the people. Same as with the delegate system in our primary elections and the Electoral College in our general elections. There's this reoccurring theme in American politics. Give the people some power to feel like democratic citizens, but make sure that those in power get to make the really important decisions. And it wasn't until over 130 years after the ratification of the United States Constitution that major Reformation efforts among progressives led to the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which allowed senators to be directly elected by the people. Even today, we continue to feel the impact of these political games. At some point or another, you may have wondered to yourself, why is the number of representatives capped at 435 members? Well, if we've learned anything in this class, the answer is and always will be politics. Who gets what, when, and how? So as we can see, after the first census was conducted in 1790, the number of representatives in the House gradually increased over time, as it was designed to do. That is, however, until 1929. What the hell happened in 1929? Why would Congress deliberately cap its own power? Well, back in the late 1700s, something called the Industrial Revolution happened. It was a period in history marked by incredible technological advancement and transformed the global economy into a manufacturing-driven market. One of such inventions that revolutionized the US economy was the cotton gin. Just 10 years after the invention of the cotton gin, the annual production of raw cotton skyrocketed from 3,000 bales to 73,000 bales. That's more than a 2,000% increase. And which states grew the most cotton? Yep. And by 1860, raw cotton exports constituted what percentage of the national US economy? Almost 60%. Oh yeah, and at the time, senators were still elected by state legislatures, which were mainly backed by cotton farmers, so everything was super corrupt, and the Southern Democrats got really accustomed to being in power. But then, a few things started to change, like the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the Second Industrial Revolution, and World War I in particular. As you can see, during the height of World War I, manufactured goods, particularly steel, far surpassed raw material exports like cotton. So the southern states realized they were quickly losing power, not only in terms of the economy, but also in population. Between 1900 and 1920, the US admitted over 14 million immigrants. And if given the choice between the Jim Crow South or the Industrial North, I think you can figure out where most immigrants decided to move. So it's no surprise that once Southern Democrats lost power in the Senate, lost power in the House, Republicans capitalized on the opportunity to cap representation at 435. Capping representation at 435 members has led to disproportionate representation in Congress. In 1910, the United States population was about 92 million people. That means that each member of the House represented approximately 212,000 people. Since the number of representatives has remained the same over the last 100 years, while population has virtually exploded, each member of the House now represents close to 750,000 people. Even so, some argue that the 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act is unconstitutional, considering that the framers specifically wrote in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution that congressional districts should never exceed 30,000 people. If the 1929 cap on membership was never instituted, today we would have about 11,000 members in the United States House of Representatives if we relied on the framers' metric of 30,000 people per district. And in case you're wondering what a body of 11,000 people looks like, that's equivalent to the seating capacity of the Jacksonville Jumbo Shrimp minor league baseball team. Fun fact. Despite the number of seats in the House of Representatives being capped at 435, the main method used to ensure fair representation across the states is through reapportionment. Reapportionment is the process by which seats in the House of Representatives are redistributed to each state to account for nationwide population shifts detected by the decennial census. So every 10 years, the United States government conducts the census to gauge population trends and shifts throughout the country. So instead of increasing the size of the House beyond 435 members, states may gain, lose, or have no change in their number of seats, depending on how the population has changed. Okay, so now we've got that all figured out. Who actually gets to decide what these districts look like? Well, in most cases, each state legislature is responsible for deciding how new congressional districts should be drawn in the event that they gain or lose seats. What could possibly go wrong with that? Well, let's take a step back for a minute. What could possibly go wrong with having state legislatures be in charge of redrawing congressional districts? After all, we the people directly elect the members of our state legislature, right? This is true, but that doesn't exactly mean that the will of the people are entirely represented. Throughout this course, we've talked a lot about how elections are plagued by low turnout, there's obstacles to voting like voter ID laws, and the fact that we have a two-party system means that while 51% of people might have voted for candidate A, that means that 49% of people who voted for candidate B aren't represented by the candidate they voted for. Things become even more disproportionate when we look at party composition across the state legislatures. There's two types of party composition I'd like you to be aware of: divided government and unified government. Divided government occurs when one party has a majority in the House of Representatives and a different party has a majority in the Senate. Unified government is when the same party has a majority in both the House and the Senate. Party trifectas are like super unified governments, and that means that the executive branch and both chambers in the legislature are controlled by the same party. So let's look at party composition across the United States and talk about why this matters. So looking at this map, red states denote a Republican-controlled legislature in both the state House and the state Senate. Blue states mean that Democrats control both chambers in the state legislature. And these yellow states here indicate divided government, meaning that one party controls the state House and a different party controls the state Senate. Now, a lot of people argue that divided government, when parties essentially have to compete against each other for power, is a good thing. In many ways, it is the most democratic system of government. For instance, if Democrats control the state Senate, then all of the Democrats in the state have some pretty good representation. And if Republicans, on the other hand, control the state House, then all of the Republicans in the state get a little bit of representation too. And that's just like what Madison said in Federalist 51. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So when we start talking about how Congress passes legislation, which requires a majority of votes in both chambers to become law, the ambition of one chamber of the legislature can be checked by the ambition of the other chamber. But that's not what we see in this map at all. Only 4 states have divided government in the entire country. And Nebraska has a nonpartisan unicameral legislature, meaning that members technically don't belong to a political party, so we're just going to ignore them for now. But what does all of this mean? What is the point? As of 2018, 32 state legislatures were controlled by the Republican Party, and 13 state legislatures were controlled by the Democratic Party. Basically, this means that there is no ambition to counteract ambition between the House and the Senate in these states. So ostensibly, this means that these states could technically pass whichever bills they wanted without any partisan interference from the other chamber. So a total of 45 state legislatures have unified government. And of those 45 states that have unified state legislatures, 36 of them have trifectas, meaning that the governor of the state also belongs to the same party that controls both chambers of the state legislature. So if a state population grows enough to gain more congressional districts, and the state legislatures get to redraw those districts, and 90% of states have state legislatures controlled by the same party, and 72% of those have party trifectas, then might those state legislatures be more inclined to draw districts in a way that benefits their party most? Of course they are. That's exactly what happens, and this is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering occurs when politicians deliberately redraw state districts in a way that advantages their party most. That's politics. Who gets what, when, and how? Those who are in charge, those who get to make the rules, will always do so in a way that benefits them most. So the term gerrymandering is actually attributed to this man here, Elbridge Gerry, actually. It's actually gerrymandering, but everyone says gerrymandering. If you want to be the one person that says gerrymandering, you go for it.
At conferences, in classes, when I'm with colleagues, I'm often the only person who resorts to gerrymander. But I'm fighting the good fight. I think it's the right pronunciation, and it does justice to the person whose name it got attached to.
Anyway, Elbridge Gerry was the governor of Massachusetts in 1812, and he signed into law the redistricting of a horribly misshapen district that blatantly benefited his own party. Political cartoonists likened the district to the shape of a salamander, and hence the term gerrymander or gerrymander was born. And I think what we really learned most from this illustration is that people in 1812 had never seen a salamander before, because this thing is just terrifying. I think mine is better. So what does gerrymandering look like today? Well, there's three main types that I'd like you to know. There's partisan gerrymandering, which either benefits or disadvantages a specific political party. There's incumbent gerrymandering, which helps keep incumbents safe during re-election. And lastly, racial gerrymandering, which often redraws districts to either consolidate or fracture minority neighborhoods. So let's look at some examples. Republicans in the North Carolina state legislature redrew North Carolina's 4th congressional district, also known as the Hanging Claw, to fit as many Democratic districts into one as possible. Often we think about gerrymandering as a means for the party in power to redraw districts to maximize their own votes. But gerrymandering is actually mostly defensive, meaning instead of drawing many districts that are likely to vote for your party, it's more advantageous to take as many districts from your opponent as possible and cram them all into one giant big district, thus minimizing the opposing party's electoral power in the state. In Maryland, Democrats redrew incumbent Representative Sarbanes' district to incorporate almost all of the state's key media markets to help him lay the groundwork for a Senate bid. And in Illinois, Democrats packed as many Hispanic voters as possible into a brand new district. So what can be done about gerrymandering? Well, first, the courts usually get involved, particularly when a district has unequal population to other districts. Such was the case in Florida's 5th district that was struck down by the Florida Supreme Court in 2014 for blatant gerrymandering. It runs from near Jacksonville in the north, hooks east for a few miles, then west for a few miles, narrows to the width of an interstate highway for a while, cuts west all the way over to Gainesville, then swivels back east and southeast, finally arriving at Orlando, a distance of about 140 miles. Racial districting has also been at the center of many legal battles. The primary outcome of these lawsuits has determined that redistricting cannot prevent groups from access to the polls. And second, some states have realized that allowing elected officials to redraw district lines often leads them to doing so at their own benefit, thus compromising the integrity of our democracy and our elections. As you can see, most states continue to entrust the state legislature with redrawing congressional districts. However, there are a handful of states who have tried to make the process a bit more egalitarian. California, Arizona, Idaho, Washington, and New Jersey, for instance, allow independent commissions consisting of non-elected officials to redraw district lines. However, in most cases, the members of each party still nominate persons to the commission. So there, you have that. And finally, Iowa has its own unique method of redistricting, allowing a nonpartisan legislative staff to redraw lines without any election data. The state legislature then votes on the redistricting plans. If the legislature fails to adopt the plans, the commission has to start all over again. So, yeah, there's a varying degree of efficiency here. So today's lecture has tried to address some of the key challenges to representation in the United States. Congress was designed to be a voice of the people, by the people. But historically, especially as we've seen today, it's very clear that the Founding Fathers put a significant amount of effort into restricting the power of the people. While people have always directly elected members of the House, the framers did not want the common person electing members to the Senate. And based upon what we know about how the framers perceived human nature, this was primarily an effort to prevent mob rule. And that's why the Senate was given significantly more power than the House over the government, such as approving international treaties, confirming the appointees of the president, and impeachment powers. And so the essence of politics, who gets what, when, and how, continues to cause most of the problems with Congress. The framers never intended for each member of the House to represent more than 30,000 people, but since Congress capped its own membership in 1929, members now represent close to 1 million voters on average. Allowing politicians to redraw district lines in their own best interests, aka gerrymandering, has also compromised the integrity of our elections and the representativeness of Congress. Several solutions have been presented to help make Congress a little bit more representative. So every few years or so, bills are introduced that would expand the membership of Congress beyond 435. One of the more popular suggestions, the Wyoming Rule, is a proposal to increase the size of the House of Representatives so that the standard representative to population ratio would be that of the smallest entity, which is currently Wyoming. So Wyoming, with a state population of about 580,000 people, if we divided the entire United States population by the population of Wyoming, that would increase the size of the House to about 563 members. A little bit better than that 11,000 we came up with earlier. Though considering how polarized Congress is, there's currently little incentive for members to compromise on something like this. And finally, while gerrymandering presents a pretty serious problem, the courts generally intervene when lawmakers go too far in redistricting. However, there are measures states could take preemptively to prevent overburdening the court with gerrymandering lawsuits, such as creating those independent commissions that we talked about to redraw districts, thus removing the temptation of politicians to benefit themselves. So let's just do a really quick recap of what we covered in Unit 1 of this lecture before we move on to Unit 2. So far, we've discussed the purpose and structure of Congress, who can run for office, what are the term limits, what are some of the key differences between the House and the Senate. We talked about problems associated with the structure of Congress, why is membership capped at 435, what is redistricting, and how is gerrymandering a function of the way that redistricting currently works in this country. Then we also discussed some potential solutions, perhaps the Wyoming Rule, or perhaps having more independent commissions for redistricting. So that's the end of Unit 1 of this lecture. So if you want to pause here, take a break, reflect on the recap, and in just a moment, we will go ahead and get started with Unit 2 of this lecture, which focuses on how a bill becomes a law. So in Unit 2, we will talk about the many ways a bill can die before it actually becomes a law and why the process is so complex, the role that party plays in organizing leadership and promoting legislation, the key differences between the powers of the House and the Senate, and how the demographic characteristics of Congress affect representation in America. Finally, make sure you take careful notes on the videos toward the end of the lecture, as you will see questions regarding this content on Exam 3. And with all that being said, let's get started. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the classic Schoolhouse Rock, the animated series from the 1970s that taught kids how to read, write, do math, as well as an introduction to the multitude of inefficiencies of the federal government. Schoolhouse Rock made a short on how a bill becomes a law. It's pretty ridiculous, but it's a classic, and I think it's a great introduction to our lecture today. So let's take a look.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old,
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
So this video, although it's kinda hokey, does a pretty good job of conveying the basics of how a bill becomes a law in Congress. But it is missing one key element. So how does our favorite game of who gets what influence which bills become law? Well, let's recap. Constituents bring an issue to the attention of their representative. In the case of the video, voters wanted a federal law passed that all school buses must stop at railroad crossings. Now, legislation can either be introduced by members of the House or the Senate, but ultimately, both chambers of Congress must approve the bill before it can become a law. So let's imagine that this hypothetical school bus bill was originally written by a member of the House. After the House member writes the bill, the Speaker of the House decides which committee the bill should go to for its first round of revisions. This is incredibly important as the Speaker of the House is one of the most powerful positions in government. Not only because the Speaker of the House is second in the line of presidential succession, only after the Vice President, but the Speaker has enormous power over whether or not bills will ever see the light of day. So this is the first potential death of a bill in Congress. If the Speaker doesn't like the bill or doesn't think it'll have enough votes to pass, she can just decide to never send it to committee, and thus the bill, along with all of its promised hopes and dreams, will die. But if the Speaker does want to see the bill pass, she sends it to committee first. Committees help lawmakers more efficiently pass legislation. Instead of a lawmaker writing a bill then automatically sending it to all 435 members for an up or down vote, bills first go to committee where a small group of lawmakers can fine-tune the legislation. As you can see, there are over a dozen specialized committees in both the House and the Senate, each dealing with a very specific policy area. So our hypothetical school bus bill would most likely be sent to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for its initial review, since school buses are a form of transportation. But transportation and infrastructure encompass a myriad of policy areas like aviation, maritime and public transportation, highways, railroads, and much more. That sounds like a lot of work, right? This is precisely why committees also have subcommittees. Again, this helps lessen the burden on committees by creating a division of labor and allowing members of Congress with policy specializations to work out the details of the bill. So basically, the members of the subcommittee, who ostensibly have a lot of knowledge in these particular policy areas, edit the bill, mark it up, and they vote on it. If the subcommittee is unable to agree on the details of a bill, they argue a lot, they call each other names, and eventually they give up on the bill and they move on to something else. This is the second potential death of the bill. But if they agree on the bill and they vote to support it, It goes back to the parent committee, in this case, Transportation and Infrastructure, and the same thing happens all over again. So if the committee can't agree on the bill, even though the subcommittee did approve it, then this is the third potential death of a bill. If the bill manages to make it out of committee alive, it then goes to a very special place called the Rules Committee. And by this point, only 10% of bills that are introduced in the House actually make it this far. The Rules Committee is unique to the House of Representatives. It determines how the bill will be debated on the open floor to all 435 members of the House. Here, committee members will put time limits on how long the bill shall be debated, and they also place a rule on the bill. And there's two types of rules that I'd like you to be aware of. One, an open rule, which means that there are no limits to the amount of amendments that can be added to a bill. Or two, a closed rule, meaning that no amendments can be added to the bill. And the easiest way to kill a bill is by allowing an open rule. This is the fourth potential death. This means that any member of the House can add any obscure amendment they want to the bill. Congressmen spend all day debating, arguing, and fighting over various amendments, and before you know it, everyone gets tired of it, they table the topic, and then they move on to something else. But if a bill can survive the amendment process, they then go to a vote on the House floor. And bills in the House only need a simple majority to pass, meaning they need 50% plus 1 votes, or 218 votes, to pass. If the bill gets less than 218 votes, well, you guessed it, bill is killed. Once a bill passes in the House of Representatives, the entire process starts all over again in the Senate. Most of the legislative features are pretty similar in the Senate. If a bill is introduced in the Senate, the President pro tempore of the Senate can also decide, just like the Speaker of the House, to not send the bill to a committee. The bill can also die in the Senate subcommittee. It can also pass the Senate subcommittee but fail in the parent committee. And as mentioned earlier, the Rules Committee is unique to the House. So if a bill makes it through the committee stage in the Senate and goes to the floor for a vote, there are no rules on how long members can debate. So if senators really want to see a bill fail, they can literally talk and talk and talk and talk, preventing any action from being taken on the bill. This is called the filibuster, and it's a unique power of the Senate. While a bill in the Senate only needs a simple majority, or 51 votes, to pass, a 3/5 vote, or 60 votes, is required to end members' filibusters. This is called a cloture vote. The filibuster was originally designed as a political tactic to help protect the minority party in Congress, so that a tyranny of a simple majority would not overtake the chamber. But it has mainly been used as political theater. Southern Democrat Strom Thurmond still holds the record for longest Senate filibuster in history, 24 hours and 18 minutes long. He was trying to defeat the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1957, so how did he spend those 24 hours and 18 minutes? Well, he read the Declaration of Independence a couple times, the Bill of Rights a couple times, and some people said he even resorted to reciting his grandmother's biscuit recipe. His congressional aides also set up a bucket in the cloakroom where he could relieve himself, all while continuing his speech, keeping one foot on the Senate floor. Though today's filibusters are markedly less interesting.
And I love this story, and so I'm going to read it to you. Sam I am. That Sam I am, that Sam I am. I do not like that Sam I am. Do you like green eggs and ham? I do not like them, Sam I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. Would you like them here or there? I would not like them here or there. I would not like them anywhere. I do not like green eggs and ham. I do not like them, Sam I am.
Thanks, Ted Cruz. So, if senators are unable to reach a 3/5 cloture vote to end a filibuster, the bill dies here. If a bill gets a cloture vote, it will almost certainly have the necessary 51 votes to pass the Senate, considering it just had 60 votes to get a cloture vote, but it could also technically fail at this stage too. The bill's congressional journey is almost over, but if the Senate version of the bill has changed significantly since its original version in the House, the bill is sent to a conference committee where members from both the House and the Senate revise the changes and vote again. Now, by this time, everyone is totally sick of the bill and they just want to see it pass, but still, it could technically fail at this stage if members from both chambers can't reach a consensus. Finally, after both chambers approve the bill, it's off to the president's desk. Once the president receives a bill, he has 10 days to sign it, and there's a few things that the president can do here. First, he can outright veto the bill and kill it on arrival. However, Congress can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers. Second, if Congress adjourns before the 10-day period has expired and the president never signs the bill, it automatically dies. This is referred to as a pocket veto, and sometimes presidents will neglect signing a bill to avoid the political ramifications of a veto. We'll talk more about the consequences of presidential vetoes and why they matter in the presidency chapter. And lastly, the president could save us all a bunch of trouble and just sign the bill and it officially becomes law. So after this exhausting journey and all the different ways to kill a bill, it's no wonder that out of the tens of thousands of bills that are generally introduced by each Congress, that only 4% become law. And when we take away bills that do things like name post offices or designate days of the year as commemorative holidays, it's probably more like 1%. So why is Congress so bad at its job? I mean, after all, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution basically says, make laws. So why do so few bills actually become law? Well, Congress is the one who decides who gets what. Who gets unemployment benefits? Who gets the corporate bailouts? Who gets health insurance? Who gets the $1,200 a month because the coronavirus is wrecking the economy? Stances on these issues boil down to political ideology. What role should the government play in our lives? And the two parties in Congress are constantly fighting over whose agenda will be implemented by law. This is why party leadership plays such an important role in determining which bills become law. In both the House and the Senate, leadership is organized between the majority party, which is the one who makes the rules, and the minority party, which basically organizes opposition to the majority. As mentioned previously, the Speaker of the House is one of the most powerful positions in the US government. Here's why. Currently, Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, because the Democrats currently hold a majority in the US House of Representatives. The Speaker, who is chosen by the majority party, has enormous legislative powers. She presides over the party, helps set the agenda, decides which bills to send to committee, and more importantly, which bills not to send to committee, and is responsible for appointing all chairs to congressional committees and subcommittees, which unsurprisingly are all Democrats. On the topic of committees, there are 4 distinct types that I would like you to be aware of. The first type is a standing committee or a permanent committee, like the example of transportation and infrastructure from earlier. These committees align with distinct policy agendas that consist of members who generally specialize in a given area. The laws passed in these committees are then executed by their corresponding departments in the executive branch, which we will talk about in far more detail during the presidency chapter. The second type of committees are conference committees. Like we've already discussed, conference committees form at the end of a legislative process to reconcile differences between the House and Senate versions of a bill. The third type of committee is a joint committee. A joint committee also involves members from both the House and the Senate, but it has no legislative authority. Joint committees serve to oversee and evaluate issues of mutual interest pertaining to congressional administration and policy development. So, all of the boring stuff. So the Joint Committee on Printing oversees the Government Printing Office, which publishes government documents. And the Joint Committee on Taxation serves to assist members of both chambers of Congress when considering tax-related legislation. The final type of committee is called a select, special, or ad hoc committee. These are usually temporary committees established to perform specific duties for Congress, like conducting investigations. So one example, which you are perhaps most familiar with, is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, which was charged with investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election. But back to leadership. Leadership is also structured in a hierarchical manner with majority and minority leaders. You also have party whips who are mainly responsible for securing party consensus on pivotal votes. And if you're a big political geek, you may recall Kevin Spacey played Frank Underwood on Netflix's House of Cards, who in season 1 was the House Majority Whip for the Democratic Party. But since then he's been canceled and just posts really weird videos on YouTube now, so we'll just move on. And so we begin to see this amazing gatekeeper power that parties have in Congress. The Speaker is the most powerful position, party is everything and leadership is hierarchical. So a quick recap. Why do we need parties and committees in Congress? First, parties and committees are critical for the division of labor. Even though only about 4% of the 11,000 bills on average that are introduced each congressional session are actually passed, that's still a lot of work to process. Parties and committees help organize the workload into more manageable sets of responsibilities. Second, organizing committees by various policy arenas allows congressmen to really utilize their past experience as a committee specialist. Third, committee assignments allow politicians to build a reputation in the party. For instance, most presidential candidates have, at one time or another, served on some of the most prestigious congressional committees. Joe Biden has chaired the Senate Foreign Relations and Judiciary Committee, Bernie Sanders has chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee, and Mike Pence and Ted Cruz, both of whom are considered top Republican contenders for the presidency in 2024, have all held top leadership positions in congressional committees. Fourth, party leadership plays the biggest role in the who gets what game, as the majority party in Congress gets to appoint all chairpersons to committees and subcommittees. And fifth, partisanship coupled with the oversight function of Congress allows the institution to check other branches of government. Though you might be thinking to yourself, what about all that unified government stuff that we talked about from earlier? Well, as you can imagine, this makes for some quite interesting dynamics when we examine which parties are in control in correspondence with the presidency. But since 1968, there have only been 14 years of single-party control, or trifecta party leadership, at the national level. Now, while you might think that when the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency are all controlled by the same party, that this would spell bad news for checks and balances, meaning that since one party controls the government, they can basically pass any law they want. And sure, sometimes this happens. During President Obama's first 2 years in office, he, along with a majority of Democrats in both the House and the Senate, were able to push through the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare. And this left a lot of people really upset because Democrats passed this law through with virtually zero Republican support. On the other hand, President Trump, who had a party trifecta in his first year in office, was unable to pass through any of his major legislative agenda. And this is because members of Congress must consider multiple factors of influence when making decisions, not just what party they belong to. First and foremost of such factors is considering the needs of your constituents, or the people that you represent. Vote against something in the best interest of your constituents, and they will hold a grudge. This brings us to point number 2. If a congressman is up for re-election, they're likely to be very careful in how they decide to vote on something. Remember just a few months ago when the Senate was debating whether or not to call additional witnesses in the Trump impeachment hearing and only needed 51 votes to get those witnesses? Democrats only needed 4 of the 53 Republicans to do this. So they turned to the 4 most moderate Republicans in the Senate: Susan Collins of Maine, Mitt Romney of Utah, Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Susan Collins, whose seat is increasingly in danger of being lost to Democrat challenger Sarah Gideon, voted yes to appease her more liberal constituents. Mitt Romney, who announced he will not be seeking re-election in 2020, has basically peaced out and voted yes without any fear of political ramifications. But Lamar Alexander, who is not seeking re-election in 2020, and Lisa Murkowski, who isn't up for re-election until 2022, both voted no, and they're from much redder states than Maine or Utah, so it's not surprising they voted no to toe the party line here. So we can see how re-election and the partisan makeup of a state play a big role in legislative behavior. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, special interests play a huge role in determining how congressmen vote. Let's see how.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question: does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left, at 0%, are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right, at 100%, are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then, those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist-written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists, those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
Well, I know that was pretty depressing, but basically, what I think we've learned in this Part 2 lecture is that our democracy is kind of in trouble right now. And based upon everything that we've talked about, it's no wonder that women only constitute 20% of Congress. It's no wonder that Congress remains overwhelmingly white. Sure, we're slowly making headway over time, both in terms of gender and with race, but even today, Congress remains mostly white, mostly male, and pretty old. The average age of a member of the House of Representatives is 57 years old, even though you will recall the minimum age qualification is 25. It's even worse in the Senate, where the average age is 62 years old, despite their minimum age requirement being 30. And just as the video demonstrated, an astonishing number of congressmen begin their careers as lawyers or privately wealthy businessmen. So all of these things together should generate serious pause over the representativeness of our democracy. So why isn't Congress more diverse? Well, it goes back to all the points we've been talking about this week. Gerrymandering helps those in power stay in power. Voter suppression laws continue to disenfranchise the most vulnerable members of our society. People are increasingly disaffected with government, they think their votes don't matter, and they don't participate. And the current state of campaign finance laws and special interest lobbying make it easier than ever to buy influence in government. But there is hope. I know we talk a lot about the problems with government, and sometimes it seems like there's nothing that can be done to overcome these obstacles. But I really hope you enjoy this next video.
So here's a crazy thing. Almost everyone I know agrees that the government of the United States, the government of the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, is completely broken. And for most of us, it's really obvious why. Lobbyists write our laws, politicians are bought, and corruption is infecting every issue that's close to our hearts. But what's even crazier is that we've all convinced ourselves that there's nothing we can do about it. And that is one of the biggest and most dangerous lies in American politics. The problem isn't that corrupt politicians are breaking the law. The problem is that we don't even have laws for them to break. Right now, corruption is legal in America, and that is something we can fix. Here's exactly how we do it. Right now, it's perfectly legal for special interests to hand huge checks to the members of Congress who regulate them. It's perfectly legal for those same members of Congress to pass laws to help out lobbyists who offer them a cushy job when they leave office. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. From million-dollar bundlers to the threat of a super PAC smear campaign, there are literally dozens of perfectly legal ways to buy a public official. But that makes the solution pretty obvious. Make corruption illegal. All of it. And that is where the American Anti-Corruption Act comes in. It introduces a strict set of ethical standards, so if you're an elected official on, say, the Senate Banking Committee, you can't take donations from banking lobbyists. It mandates full transparency, so the American people know exactly who's trying to buy our elected officials. It changes how elections are funded, so clean candidates can win without selling out to special interests. And it does all of this while protecting the people's right to free speech. That's because the act was written by top constitutional scholars, conservative and liberal alike, to stand up to the toughest scrutiny. You can read the full text of the act at anticorruptionact.org. And speaking of the Constitution, let's talk about a little Supreme Court ruling called Citizens United. Here's the thing. While a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United would help clamp down on those shady groups with names like Americans for Freedom and Jobs and More Freedom, it wouldn't fix any of the problems we talked about before. You could pass that amendment tomorrow and the bribery, the extortion, the conflicts of interest, all of it would still be legal. But in a weird way, that's actually good news because it means we can solve a huge part of this problem with a plain old law. The question is, how do we get it passed? I mean, asking Congress to do it is like asking a fox to put a lock on the hen house. The greasy, dirty, disgusting fox. And also, the fox is a congressman and not a fox at all. Look, my point is, we can go around Congress using a little something called the ballot initiative process. It lets citizens pass laws ourselves, no politicians required.
All we have to do is gather enough signatures, put anti-corruption acts up to a simple public vote, and we can start fixing the corrupt system right at home. Here's our plan, in 5 steps. First, we'll need a law to pass. One that, actually fixes things. Okay, Anti-Corruption Act. Check. Next, we need to bring conservatives and progressives together and get organized. It's the only way to build enough power to defeat the politically entrenched and well-funded opposition. We're in good shape there, though, because everyone already agrees we need to fix our corrupt system. In fact, local Tea Partiers and progressive activists actually teamed up to pass America's first Anti-Corruption Act in 2014.
And the movement has racked up even more victories since.
There are more than 22,000 cities in America where we can use the ballot initiative process to pass locally tailored anti-corruption acts. And this really matters. We're protecting our communities from corruption, so our schools, hospitals, local resources, and jobs are no longer under the constant threat of getting sold out to special interests. Plus, citywide initiatives and resolutions build momentum for the most powerful way we can go around Congress: passing anti-corruption acts in states. State acts not only clean up statewide corruption, they change how elections are funded so clean candidates can win office without selling out to special interests. That goes for federal candidates from that state too. Once we pass these state laws, we can send a new wave of representatives and senators to Washington. State by state, we can fill Congress with leaders who got elected under the rules of our new anti-corruption acts, replacing entrenched politicians with new blood. See how this works? By taking the fight to the states, we can fix Congress from the outside. And when these new representatives get to Congress, free from dependence on special interests, they'll be free to vote for and pass the American Anti-Corruption Act at the federal level to fix this problem for good. So that's the plan, and 500,000 Represent Us members couldn't agree more. We're bringing conservatives and progressives together to pass anti-corruption acts across America and put power back in the hands of the people, where it belongs. We need millions more people to join, and that includes you. Start by clicking here and we'll tell you exactly how you can help.
Alright guys, that's it for this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed all of the content. I know we covered a lot of material today, so please be sure to use the optional discussion board in case you have any questions about anything that we covered. Stay healthy, stay safe, and as always, thanks for watching.